Buenos días, mi nombre es Rames Sarwat, soy el responsable de alianzas en IDB en Paz. Me gustaría introducirlo, no sé si aquellos que están sentados allí se ve o me iré moviendo porque si no me van a ir viendo. Bueno, en primer lugar, muchísimas gracias por asistir a esta convocatoria. Estamos encantados de que hayan aceptado unirse a nosotros y a nuestros aliados estratégicos de Palo Alto. Como saben, hoy es una sesión a la que llamamos Jam Session, es una sesión en la que nos dedicamos a tratar de introducir un determinado tema que esté de vanguardia junto con algún alto ejecutivo de nuestros aliados estratégicos. No se oye, ¿no? Perdón. Decía que las Jam Sessions son normalmente sesiones que hacemos exclusivas con un reducido número de personas que trabajan, normalmente clientes, que junto con nuestros aliados estratégicos pues tratamos de explicarles algún tema que esté en boga, ¿no? Simplemente volver a reiterarles nuestro agradecimiento a que estén aquí y me gustaría que Javier de Palo Alto pues, presentase un poco al equipo, ¿no? que nos une hoy aquí.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias, Rames. En primer lugar, bueno, agradeceros a todos vuestra asistencia, como bien apuntaba Rames, y muchísimas gracias a Eleven Paths por la colaboración que tenemos, por el espacio que nos han cedido, y esperemos que compartamos todos una jornada aquí muy agradable, ¿vale? Yo entré en Palo Alto hace ya 5 años prácticamente, ¿vale? Y bueno, desde entonces el tema ha cambiado muchísimo. Yo, para empezar, he cambiado yo físicamente, que he engordado unos 20 kilos desde que entré aquí, que es una cosa que me ha perjudicado bastante a nivel físico, pero también hemos crecido mucho. Yo era el quinto y ahora somos más o menos 23 personas entre la parte de aquí de España y la parte de Holanda, que tenemos ahí parte del equipo también. Hemos crecido un montón en cuanto a referencias. Yo me acuerdo cuando entré yo que estaban Tony y Jesús Díaz por un lado y otro comercial llevando privado con un ingeniero ahí machacando la calle y tal, y bueno, ahora la estructura es muy potente. Tenemos más de 850 referencias a nivel nacional. La facturación en España va a ser estimadamente unos 26 millones este año, con lo cual está muy creciendo. El equipo crece mucho, nosotros crecemos con él. Y nada, esperemos que todos vosotros disfrutéis de hoy, ¿vale? Os voy a presentar un poco a la gente que ha venido de Palo Alto. Juan Luis Garijo es el Major Account Manager que se llama aquí, él lleva sector público, igual que Inditex y el Corte Inglés. Juan Matáis también es Major Account Manager, que lleva parte de privado, sobre todo banca e industria. Tenemos a Carlos Corbacho, que es ingeniero preventa, llevando la zona de centro, ciertos verticales y la parte de Galicia. Antonio Huertas también ingeniero preventa, que lleva Telefónica como cliente final en este caso, hueso duro de roer. Y luego tenemos finalmente a JD Lehmann, que está allí, que tenemos allí, que es nuestro VP para toda Europa de Service Providers. Y finalmente, no me enredo más, os presento a Greg Day, es nuestro CSO. Él ha tenido una historia muy interesante que ahora os contará a lo largo de su vida laboral y espero que os guste mucho su presentación, ¿vale?
Hola. Hola. So my apologies firstly, I've started learning Spanish. At the minute I can tell you how to get a drink, how to eat, my daughter, my son, all the basics, but not the things that are going to help me today. So apologies. I need cybersecurity for Spanish beginners. I will try and speak reasonably slowly, but if you don't understand, please wave, ask questions. The goal of today is to share knowledge and experience. So if we need translators, I think we have plenty of people around the room that can help translate, so we can get the most from it. And please, I'd ask if you have any questions, do ask them as we go along. There was really two kind of goals today. One is to share a little bit of insight around. Are you going to do your slides? Yeah. Perfect.
So, I was sorry for switching into Spanish. Bueno, disculpad, ha habido una pequeña confusión. Yo solo quería introduciros dos conceptos y ya os dejo con la parte interesante de Greg y todo su conocimiento. Simplemente me gustaría explicar qué es IDB en Paz, porque supongo que he renunciado a presentar todos los que estamos aquí en Telefónica porque me llevaría bastante tiempo, luego supongo que nos podremos ir presentando. Simplemente quería comentaros qué es IDEB en Paz y un poco las ciberamenazas o tipo de ataques que creemos que sucederán o con las que nos vamos a ir encontrando en el 2017. IDEB en Paz es una unidad global de Telefónica. Lo que significa es que trabajamos no en un ámbito nacional, no solamente en España, sino que somos como una factoría de productos y servicios de ciberseguridad para todo el grupo Telefónica. Todo lo que hacemos, lo hacemos con un ámbito global y para que se pueda comercializar o operar en todos los países, en los 21 países donde Telefónica tiene presencia y en otros países donde no tiene presencia como operador, pero tiene acuerdos con otras operadoras o con la división internacional de Telefónica, con lo cual nuestro ámbito es global, ¿no? La comercialización de estos productos siempre se produce a través de la operadora local, en este caso, en el caso de España, Telefónica de España, o a través de un conjunto de partners que también están habilitados para que puedan comercializar esas soluciones, ¿no? Desde el punto de vista de la ciberseguridad, bueno, pues hemos ido viendo cómo realmente ha ido evolucionando la ciberseguridad. Hemos visto que el tipo de ataques han ido volviéndose mucho más complejos hasta ahora y simplemente quería dar una pequeña pincelada de lo que a través de nuestro SOC, de nuestros Security Operation Centers que estamos viendo el tipo de ataques, pues hemos tratado de hacer una predicción de qué tipo de ataques nos podemos encontrar o nuestros clientes pueden encontrarse en el 2017, ¿no? Principalmente, bueno, los he ido resumiendo, seguro que hay algunos más, pero he intentado resumir aquellos que son principales o creemos que se van a producir dentro del 2017. En primer lugar, veremos una sofisticación de ransomware, ¿no? El secuestro de ordenadores y de servidores, ¿no? Quizá me he permitido traer este caso que quizá hayan oído en los medios, es de hace apenas 4 o 5 días, donde un hotel ¿no? Consiguieron a través de ese secuestro que los clientes quedasen, digamos, bloqueados dentro de sus habitaciones porque controlaban, digamos, la apertura de las puertas, etcétera, ¿no? Y pagaron una importante cantidad. Lo que pensamos que sucederá es que el ransomware, que hasta ahora atacaba a particulares y a pequeñas empresas, se va a ir sofisticando y atacará a grandes corporaciones que son capaces, ¿no?, de pagar mayores rescates por recuperar esa información, ¿no? También veremos tipo de ataques más sofisticados en cuanto a denegación de servicios. Durante el 2016 hemos visto que se ha duplicado el número de ataques de servicio distribuida y veremos que se irán sofisticando bastante más, ¿no? Veremos tipo de ataques relacionados con el maladvertisement, que podremos ver que los cibercriminales adquieren legítimamente espacios publicitarios donde publican links que redirigen a las personas, a los usuarios hacia, digamos, páginas que distribuyen malware, con lo cual se están utilizando este tipo de canales que realmente deberían ser legítimos para redirigir este tipo de ataques. Tenemos ataques de phishing mucho más sofisticados, ¿no? Creo que habrán oído el famoso ataque del CEO, ¿no?, donde que últimamente ha aparecido en medios, donde suplantando, ¿no?, la identidad del CEO de una compañía, acaban enviando correos realmente muy bien trabajados y muy dirigidos hacia el director financiero de una compañía y pidiéndole que por favor hagan determinadas transferencias y tal, de forma urgente y confidencial porque se está evaluando la compra de una determinada empresa o la compra de un determinado activo y sorprendentemente están teniendo bastante éxito. También veremos ataques relacionados con, lógicamente, la nube y los dispositivos móviles, ¿no? Cada vez tenemos más información en la nube y en dispositivos móviles y veremos ataques más sofisticados en este sentido. Y, por último, dos puntos interesantes. Uno de ellos sería, estamos ampliando la superficie de ataque con los dispositivos IoT, con los wearables, con muchísimos dispositivos conectados, ¿no?, a Internet y a las redes, y veremos que este tipo de dispositivos se están utilizando incluso, como hemos podido ver hace poco, y con la red de la botnet Mirai, utilizar estos dispositivos para crear ataques de denegación de servicio u otro tipo de ataques. Y por último, sí hemos percibido que hay un tipo de ataques en cuanto a atacar la inteligencia artificial, ¿no? Cada vez tenemos más algoritmos de inteligencia artificial gobernando sistemas, ¿no? Y vemos que el tipo de ataques se están sofisticando para tratar de alcanzar estos sistemas y tratar de organizar pagos o, en cualquier caso, ponerlos a favor de los ciberdelincuentes, ¿no? Como realmente los ataques cada vez son más complicados, lo que necesitamos, y en el IDEMPA estamos convencidos de que juntos sumamos más, no podemos abordar todo tipo de ciberamenazas de una forma unívoca, y por eso llevamos unos años con un programa de partnership, ¿no? Donde buscamos los aliados, ¿no? Y pensamos que juntos tenemos más posibilidades, ¿no? Información de inteligencia con otras compañías que también trabajan en este ámbito, y también tenemos un programa de partnership que nos permite trabajar con aquellas empresas que consideramos punteras en el mercado para ofrecer servicios de valor añadido. Una de ellas que nos acompaña es Palo Alto, que pertenece a lo que llamamos los partners estratégicos. Es un club reducido donde trabajamos con las principales empresas y tratamos de que esa relación sea estrecha, donde hacemos desarrollos conjuntos, investigaciones conjuntos y sacamos servicios únicos, uniendo las capacidades tanto de Telefónica como estos partners estratégicos, ¿no? Por último, simplemente comentarles, nos interesa mucho su opinión, ¿no? Es decir, al final o durante, ahora si podemos hacerles entrega de un cuestionario, nos interesará si al final del evento tienen a bien escribir o compartir con nosotros la opinión del evento. Nos interesa ir mejorando. Les hacemos entrega al final de un pendrive donde habrá un interesante libro escrito por Greg, ¿no? Y explicando la ciberseguridad, ¿no? Y con la participación de algunas otras personalidades, explicando la ciberseguridad para directivos, ¿no? En este caso es un libro, inicialmente existía una versión americana, en este caso se ha sacado una versión europea, que les haremos entrega. Es un libro en inglés, en formato electrónico, y también les entregaremos una copia y una licencia para que puedan utilizarla de nuestro producto MetaShield, que trabaja para evitar la fuga de información asociada a metadatos de los documentos. Es un plugin que pueden instalar en Outlook, ¿no? Y cada vez que envíen un documento externamente se encargará de aplicar una política y evitar que dichos documentos tengan metadatos asociados. Y sin más, pues vuelvo a darle la palabra a Greg Day y les dejo con la conferencia. Muchísimas gracias.
Brilliant, thank you. The good thing in cybersecurity is even when I don't speak Spanish, it's pretty easy to get the gist of the conversation. And I think it was interesting to see there just how cybersecurity can truly impact in everything that we do. And I don't know if any of you have ever come from the CISP qualification. And cybersecurity started around the idea of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And actually, there's a lot of discussion now whether there's a new letter that we need to add to that, which is actually safety, physical, human safety. As more and more digital becomes a part of everything we do, whether it's being locked in a hotel, whether it's car crashes, everything else. To me, and it may sound strange, kind of highlights we live in such an exciting time where technology plays such a key role in our lives. And it kind of nicely ties into the theme of today. I've spent, I think now, 25, heading towards 30 years in the industry, and I honestly think 2017 is probably going to be one of the most important years in cybersecurity in my working career. And I think that's for a couple of different reasons. One is, the simple realization, and this came from the World Economic Forum, that because of the digital twinning, i.e. everything we do has some kind of digital component, cyber is now one of the most important parts of society. And if you've not seen this diagram before, this is if you like, from world leaders that look at the financial economies and consider what things could really impact on society. And they look at it in two ways: the impact, how much would it impact society, and the likelihood. You know, is this something that's never going to happen, or is it going to happen next week? And it's pretty small to read, but sort of in the, if there's a little laser on here, maybe there you can see cyber attacks sits up there literally now in the, you know, the top 5 or 6 of events that could have a significant impact across society as a whole. And so I think, you know, one is our realization of just how important cyber is for us. And it then kind of leans into the conversation that we wanted to have today. Over the last 3 or 4 years, the European Union has been working on new legislation. And I think you can look at it, and somebody described this the other day, and I'm going to take their phrase, and I hope this phrase works here. There's this idea of, is the glass half empty or is it half full? Is that a phrase you've heard before? And I see a lot of people like, oh, new regulation, more requirements, I've got to get through it. Actually, for me, I look the other way, and you know, cybersecurity is like being caught in a tornado. I mean, it just keeps going round and round, and there's always new threats, there's new technology, there's new business demands every day. And it's very rare that we get to kind of step back into the kind of the calm landscape and go, are we still doing the same thing that we set out to do 5 years ago, 10 years ago? So the changes in legislation for me are a really rare opportunity for us to take a bit of a step back and go, are we still on the right track? Have we got the right fundamental principles in place? Or is it time to reevaluate and think, what do we need now for the next 5, 10 years? So the main part of today is to kind of go through some of those thoughts. But I kind of thought I'd just set a bit of the scene before that. And a couple of different ways we can do it. One is just to share a bit of some of the technology trends. I'm sure many of you are looking at kind of some of these different items, but you know, I think if I kind of play this to its simplest element, there is a realization that information is an opportunity, no matter how you look at it. Whether it is better understanding your customers, whether it's new abilities to provide solutions, whether it's for all of us just being able to be more creative in what we do in life. The reach of information is pretty limitless. And so what makes the differentiator on that now is how you mesh that data together. Whether it's your smartphone linking to your smartwatch, whether it's your Fitbit linking to your healthcare program, you know, whether it's your social media profile linking to your business network. It's all about how do we cross-correlate all these different bits of information, and then actually how can we actually manipulate that data. And so if you look at some of the big technology trends, artificial intelligence, machine learning, you know, I think Splunk did a brilliant job in the last few years of kind of going, let's build a data structure and make it kind of freely addressable. Let's not put it in a preordained structure, because actually what we want to do with it we might not yet realize. So intelligent apps, intelligent things, all of these things are about how do we gather information. And then a big part of it is around how do I manipulate that data? And augmented or virtual reality is, now I've got so much information, how do I make this into something that's actually digestible and usable? And then we come down to kind of, you know, how do I actually share that data, conversation systems. And I think one of the most interesting discussions, blockchain. You know, how do we actually trust each other online? And blockchain isn't necessarily a new mechanism of authentication, but it's a way of keeping a digital ledger that makes it much harder to manipulate, and therefore gives us more confidence in the accuracy of the information that sits behind there. Kind of these weren't put in a specific kind of priority stack, but the one that kind of relates most to us is adaptive cybersecurity. And I kind of always love, in our industry, we love coming up with descriptors. So, you know, I'd love to ask, anyone tell me, what do you think adaptive cybersecurity really is? Is it different, or is that kind of just the new marketing spin that sits upon the top of this? It's two-way, by the way. You know, I'll kind of share maybe my view on this, and you know, the most important bit of adaptive for me is, as I looked through the kind of the evolution of this, was we've spent maybe 10, 15 years trying to stop everything. And we put different layer after layer after layer. And then in the last few years, we've kind of got to that point of going, well, we can't stop everything. And I think adaptive, for me, at its simplest level, is almost as it described, which is we need to look at the environments and realize what the risks are and put in the relevant controls, but recognize that we will try and prevent, but sometimes we might have to respond. We need to be flexible to the world that we're trying to support. So one of the things I get asked to do every year, and I have to be honest, I kind of hate this because I'm never going to win this, is to do some predictions for 2017. So what are the things that I see as priorities? I have two remits. One is to keep our organization safe, both physical security and cybersecurity. And then the second half is to kind of share knowledge and best practices. So, you know, at the very top of my list was compliance and preparation for compliance with GDPR and NIS. They go live in 2018. I'll tell you, our goal as an organization is to be there by mid to late 2017, because we want, ideally, 6 months to really validate those, bake them in, and make sure we are where we really think we are. The next one for me is an interesting one, which is, I think over the last 3 to 4 years, there's been a lot of discussion around, is antivirus no longer fit for purpose? And having spent 20 years working at McAfee and Symantec, you know, I think they're brilliant technologies. But now we have some different ways of solving the problem. Next generation endpoint solutions, we have one, Traps at Palo Alto Networks. There are many others out there. And what I see is confusion in the marketplace. You know, which is better? Is antivirus really gone? And if so, do I need a new one? And is the new solution behavioral? Is it machine learning? Is it big data? Is it mathematical? And actually, I think the biggest danger here is kind of the do nothing. Because it's easy to kind of take that step back and go, I'm going to wait for somebody else to figure out the answer and to do the testing. And once they've figured it out, then I will kind of, you know, I'll learn from that and take that. And I think, you know, it's in one way a very sane approach, but in the other way, I think what we've seen is ransomware has massively shifted the market. And I think we've moved from a cybersecurity space where having a few systems breached historically was almost kind of an acceptable part of, you know, they got in, but they hadn't necessarily done anything bad, and the impact was low. And now what we see is more and more ransomware, and ransomware getting more and more targeted. And what it means is that first second they get to that right system, now the impact is immediate. And so it changes, if you like, our measure of success, that one or a few being compromised is no longer acceptable to the business. How do I see the cybersecurity landscape changing? Very interestingly, a year or two ago, what I really expected was a lot of the, if you like, traditional cybercrime to go mobile into Apple Pay and the different wallets that are coming out. But I think actually ransomware has overtaken that. And ransomware is proven, if you look at things like Cryptowall, one group, we managed to track over $325 million moving through Bitcoin wallets, just how successful it can be. And actually, it's relatively simple. So I think ransomware is still very much in its infancy. We've seen them starting to move into the Apple environment, into the mobile device environment. And what we've started definitely to see is ransomware almost kind of crossing paths with APTs, where it now starts to become more focused, more targeted. And when they do that, what that means is now they're generally asking for much more higher but relevant ransoms. So if I know that your business is driving $1 million a week and it's tied into this data, then they're going to be probably asking you for $500,000 a week. If I know that your business is driving, you know, 100,000, probably be 50,000. The other thing we've seen a real growth back in the last year was DDoS has made a real resurgence. And I think what we're going to see is DDoS move laterally. And I think one of the first areas we'll see it move is in spaces like retail, where cybersecurity skills aren't so good and probably they don't have DDoS capability. But again, there's a real direct correlation. If I can impact your ability to drive revenue, then would you just pay to get out of that problem? So I think DDoS will go lateral. And then the third one is probably, I think, the toughest challenge for us. If I think about what most cyber attacks are all about, historically, it's credential theft. Whether it was getting your domain password, whether it's getting your banking password, it was stealing your credentials to then mimic you. And the cloud adds a new dimension to this. And we're already starting to see this. So if I can steal your credentials, what it means through the cloud is I no longer need any network access in many instances to your business. I use Office 365 through a web browser, and now I can send emails pretending to be you, and I've got trusted access into the business. If you're using OneDrive or Box or any other kind of cloud sharing point, I can access information without actually coming into your business. If you're using SaaS applications. And so now what we start to have is we've had all of these trigger and capture points to monitor what's going on in our own network. But if the attacker doesn't need to touch your network anymore, that's going to make us have to really fundamentally think about how do we get visibility across all of those third-party systems to spot that information misuse or theft or copying. Now kind of go, what are some of the challenges to dealing with all of this? And I saw a stat last year which kind of amazed me, but it doesn't surprise me. There are more open job vacancies in purely the US for certified cybersecurity practitioners. And what does that mean? People that have got something like a CISP qualification than have been certified around the world in CISP to date. That is the shortfall we have in skills. And interestingly, what we see is, you know, the salaries for those skills is going up because we don't have the capacity to meet demand. So we see people moving jobs more frequently. And so, you know, the challenge for all of us is the number of devices we have to support, the number of IPs is only ever going to go up. The complexity of what we have is only ever going to go up. But what we have is a resource capability that's not keeping pace. So we have to think about how do we work smarter and use the resources in a way that, you know, is exciting for them and keeps them loyal to our own organizations, but B, allows us to keep pace with the growing and the evolving challenges that we have to face. Cyber insurance is another area we've been looking at, and it's been kind of slowly kind of clicking away over the last few years. And in the US, it's kind of moved up. In Europe, we're still kind of down in kind of the single, early double digits of adoption. But one of the things I hear most, you know, when I talk to board members is they struggle to understand the implications of cyber. You know, if I think of things like, you know, the financial industry, we had the mortgage crisis. Board members actually had taken a proactive decision, said, look, you know, offering high interest rate mortgages that were risky because they were, you know, 90, 100+ %, there was a great reward, big profit possibilities, but there was risk. And they could understand that risk. Cybersecurity, I met with the CFO of a bank last week or week before at the World Economic Forum, and he said, look, I still have my security team every week coming to me, telling me there's another end of the world scenario coming, but I don't really understand why it is or what it is, so now I have to make a tough call. Do I spend the money or don't I spend the money? And so I think cyber insurance is still in its infancy, but where I think it's going to really help us is to start to qualify better actually kind of commercial implications of some of this. This is where they've got skills and experience of being able to look and go, you know, what would this really mean to your business? What's the likelihood? What would be the commercial implications to help do that translation between the technical problem and the business implications? And the final one is kind of the one I think we're kind of all waiting for, and we're starting to see the early inklings. We were watching, I think, very much IoT space and going, how is somebody going to attack it? And if you've not seen, literally this week, we've seen Shamoon, in fact, over the last 2 or 3 weeks, focus back on the Middle East, trying to attack both devices and OT systems. But actually, more interestingly, was late last year, where we saw IoT devices, personally owned and business owned, that had very poor security, no passwords or default passwords, that were being compromised and then being used to DDoS back against public infrastructure and business infrastructure. And I think as this world grows at such pace, what we're going to see is more and more kind of what I would call cross-domain attacks, spanning those bridges. And what I see still in too many organizations is the OT team is kind of very siloed from the IT team, and kind of IoT generally in most places doesn't really sit anywhere unless you're a more progressive organization. I think we have to quickly figure out how do we bring those worlds together and start to think about kind of those cross-domain implementations. So what are some of the positives that we can think of this? And this is kind of, I'd like to say this is kind of my work, but this is from discussions that I've had at Gartner, RSA, with the authors of the Navigating the Digital Age. Some of the top tips I give you to take away from today. Number one is kind of quality intelligence. And I kind of look at that in a couple of different ways. All of us gather a huge amount of big data around what's going on in our own environments. And yet, I would challenge just about every organization, when we go do some network analysis and discovery, we still find environments we didn't know about, unsanctioned SaaS applications, cloud services running that we didn't know. So, you know, to me, fundamentals, if we don't know what we've got, how do we keep it safe? The flip side of all of this big data we gather is actually starting to pull out some of the trends. I'm always horrified when I still see businesses being compromised by SQL injection, which is now a 10-year-old method of compromise, but it's still going on. And part of that is we have very complex environments, but we should kind of be able to look at some of these trends and go, you know, that hits important things, so we need to double down on the effort, and we should be able to figure out the things that are really important and make sure we've got those covered. Implement proper proactive measures, and I think, you know, this is back to my challenge to the early point is, for me, this is the era where you go and say, let me step back, and I have to make my own decisions. You know, does the next generation capability give me benefits that I didn't have before? And how do I build something that scales for the future? And I think there are a wealth of phenomenal new technologies out there, and I challenge you, you know, to look at them not just in terms of what they do, but I think the human skills, the most important bit is how easy are they for you to use and integrate into your broader strategy? And again, you know, great partners here with Telefonica. You know, how do you often look at what do you either do yourself or what do you actually take as a service that frees up the resource you've got to focus on having that purely internal knowledge? Understand the compliance regulations. And, you know, I think the key bit for me is this is really driving cybersecurity to a board level. And I'll kind of share with you just kind of the goods and bads of this. I spoke to one company recently, and they said, yeah, our lawyers are all over this. We've figured out we're going to argue what the definition of a breach is. And I'm kind of like, that's a road to disaster, honestly, in my eyes. Absolutely, we all need to get our own legal guidance. But at the end of the day, this is about driving confidence in business. So we should be looking at understanding what our responsibilities are, making sure that our business leaders understand those, and we're working to achieve them, not to circumnavigate them. Understand your technology. I've talked about know your network, know your devices, know the things that are out there. And I think probably one of the biggest bits of that for me is we're definitely moving from a mindset of cloud, maybe, to now cloud, yeah, makes sense. A lot of us are now cloud first, to in the next few years probably a cloud-only strategy. And again, I think that really you start to have to think about, you know, where is that data housed? Which clouds are you using? How do I cross-pollinate the data between my cloud and a different cloud? How does that move through my supply chain? What's the ecosystem that sits behind that? If I think about cloud, the kind of natural, if you like, partner to that, and if you like, probably our biggest focus as a security technology vendor is how do we help drive those security capabilities in the cloud, and then all of the things that are going to be connecting to those. And I think most of us have kind of got very comfortable with MDM solutions, so I think most of us use those. But I think now it's the bit that you go, so what is the natural complement? Where do I go next? And I'd look at it, if you have support for Android, I challenge now, actually, there's enough Android malware out there, you need to be looking at threat prevention. If you're using iOS or Windows, the threat isn't so great. But actually the bigger challenge for me, and when I think about this for our organization, what I'm thinking about is information flows. Because what I now have is two worlds that are kind of stuck together and I have to keep apart. You know, we take privacy very seriously. And, you know, for us as an organization, I'm sure many of you, we tolerate that balance between personal data, personal applications, business data, business applications. So how do I silo and separate those two worlds? How do I decide whether I allow my users to have, for example, things like Facebook? You know, if you like, the personal use accepted applications versus maybe some of the personal use unaccepted applications, and I do that filtering, but without necessarily doing the analysis of content. And then I look at the business applications and I go, how do I make sure that they're using the right business applications and actually have the right information flows? Is it going through a secure tunnel? How do I do that without putting an agent onto their system? How do I ensure that when they put data onto their device, that they aren't then putting it into a cloud that isn't secure from my business? Yes, maybe I support them using Box, but I don't support them just putting up on an open file share. And actually, even when they put it up on Box, how do I know what they've put up there to make sure that that Box share isn't an open share and it's only the right kind of content? So kind of really starting to understand those worlds for me is kind of tantamount, and obviously encryption and visibility is core to that. The final part for me is the people aspect. And I think we've talked about the lack of skills, but one of the things I think we've certainly learned in the last few years is, and it's a big part of GDPR and NIST again, is cybersecurity cannot be something that is just technical. It has to be something that's a core across the whole business. And legislation is going to drive that. And I think one of the best things I can encourage you to do is, as you start looking at what you perceive are the risks and how you're going to mitigate them, run some fire drills. Get your CEO, general counsel, HR, all of those different teams involved in a fire drill, because in my experience, that's the best way for them to start to understand the world we live in. When they've got to deal with it, when we come back to them saying, right, this person did this, what are we going to do about it? This information has leaked out the business. Do we want to tell? How are we going to tell? Who's going to stand up and do that? Get them engaged in that process early on so they start to understand it, their responsibilities, and I think very importantly, agree what are the metrics that you're going to be sharing with them on an ongoing basis that gives them confidence you're in the right place. So, hopefully that kind of just sets a bit of scene. Before I go on to the EU legislation side, is there any other questions I can answer? Don't be shy. I'm sure we could create a prize. Perfect. Okay. Well, please, if there's any that come up, do ask as we go along. I'm conscious, I keep walking in the middle and going, I've got my back to somebody. So if I do that, then everybody gets a bit of back and front, and then I'm going to come back out a bit. So here's the bit I have to do. I work for an American cybersecurity company. We all know America is the litigious capital of the world. And so, the reason that we've kind of put this together is I've spent probably 3 or 4 years being very heavily involved in GDPR and NIS. Everything from lobbying down in Brussels, through to looking at what it means to our organization, through to discussing with lots of others. And, I think one of the things we've really learned in cybersecurity in the last 4 or 5 years is the more we collaborate, the more we succeed. So the goal of this is to really share some of the things that I've learned and try and translate some of the, what I would call EU legal babble. And it gives me empathy because I look, and if you've downloaded this at the 40, 50 page, EU guides, I kind of wanted the 5-line version in plain, simple English. So I'm going to take you through some of the things that we've kind of translated back. I would encourage you to get your own legal guidance, but this is the bit to say that I'm not a lawyer. If I were a lawyer, I'd be using bigger and longer words, and I would be charging by the word and the minute. So the most important bit for me is just the underlying premise. And I've kind of mentioned this before, but kind of why now? Why have we got these new bits of regulation? The fundamental principle behind this is, to drive confidence in all of us as citizens and users in technology that it is a safe and enjoyable experience. And it comes back to this realization that just about everything we do has some level of digital dependency. And I think that's kind of really important because sometimes we look at these things and you go, it adds work or it adds cost or it, changes what we have to do. But the intent behind this, I think, was a really good intent. So let me kind of go straight into kind of the heart of this. We have had data protection laws now for, 10, 15 plus years. And that came back in, I think it was 1995. there was the EU came up with something called the General Data Protection Regulation Directive. Now, I had to kind of get my head around this. A directive is something that the EU generates that is a requirement for every nation to go create their own law. And so one of the things we've learned over those 15 years was every nation did that, and every nation came up with a different outcome. So for those of you that are working in multiple countries, what you end up with was multiple different laws to follow. And that is a legal burden and a regulatory overhead. So one of the first and most fundamental requirements of this was to say, let's learn from that experience, and we're going to harmonize. So this time it's not a directive, it is a regulation. So that means it is one set of rules that is consistent across all of the EU. Even I was waiting for the Brexit jokes, and thank you for not abusing me. That even applies to UK companies, really for two reasons. One is, even when we eventually leave the EU, if we get there, most companies are holding EU citizens' data. And this is kind of the second point. They've put in it a concept that they call extraterritoriality. And what this means is the law is based around protecting EU citizens. It doesn't matter where your company is based. You could be based in the UK, you could be based in America, China, Russia. You are accountable to this regulation. Now, actually, already the UK has announced that they are still going to follow GDPR, so we don't get away from it even if we wanted to. So the good news is it tries to harmonize, to simplify. It's based around EU citizens, and within it, it has kind of a number of kind of key tenets that relate to us. There's a whole world, if you've got your data privacy officer that kind of applies to them, that I'm glad to be on the fringe. I'm going to focus on what applies from a cybersecurity perspective. Now, the first bit is it adds in kind of a broader scope. They use the term a data processor and a data controller. So a data controller is if you, as an organization, reach out to your customers and you ask them for data, you are the controller of the data. You are the custodian that has got it from that organization. What they've also added in is the same requirements now around data processors. So the simplest example, here we are, we're in the Telefonica building. I'm sure they do 1,000,001 marketing campaigns. Some of those are probably through third-party marketing companies. So Telefonica hands over those customer records to that marketing company. They are now a processor of that data. Now the requirement says now that as a controller, you have to ensure that any processors you share the data with have the same level of regard for cybersecurity that you do. And that's not just a one line in a contract saying you agree to this. You actually have had to have done some inspection. And more importantly, if I think of this from the flip side of, let's say that processor loses that information, if you can show that you applied the right due diligence to make sure they had the right controls, then I think the accountability would lie with them for potentially failing to live up to those expectations. If they had a breach and there's no evidence that you ever actually inspected to see the same regard, then there'll be a shared responsibility. So it broadens the scope and the reality that kind of information is this cyber mesh. It's not just about how you have it, but how you share it with others. It adds in, and probably the most fundamental bit here, the requirement that says you must have relevant regard for risk, which basically says if I hold a little bit of information, then it's low risk. Depending on what that information also impacts the risk. And they look at things that are generally perceived to be personal, religious beliefs, sexual orientation, health information, all of those kind of things move the risk higher. So you kind of have to look where you are on the risk scale, and then you need to have relevant regard for state of the art. And that's probably one of the things that confuses most people, because if you've been involved in things like PCI is very prescriptive. You must have IPS, you must have antivirus, you must have these kind of things. Now the difference between the two is PCI is an industry regulation, and they can modernize it and update it as frequently as they need to, because it's driven by the membership. With EU regulation, if you look, how long have we had the last general data protection regulation? It's been, a couple of decades. So they couldn't do the same thing. They couldn't turn around and say, you must have features X, Y, and Z. How long would that be fit for purpose? 2 years, 3 years, it'd be out of date. So what they had to do was to think of a way of putting almost a placeholder in that says, it will be your responsibility to keep an eye on what are the current best practices, what are the current capabilities, and apply those in your business. Now, other things that has been added in was breach reporting, and this is new for us in most European countries. And again, if you have to think about the good intent of this. So imagine an organization you've given your credit card to, and they lose that information. You'd want to know because you might want to get that card replaced. And so, you know, the goal of this is any time that you have an incident, you will be required to notify your national authority and work with them to decide whether that is something it is in the interest to notify the public so they can take the right appropriate actions. And I'll explain a little bit more about what that kind of really means. So the specifics behind this is the language they use is you have best endeavors within 72 hours to notify. And that will ask all sorts of questions, I'm sure, in your head. Kind of some of the questions in my head is, when does the breach actually start? And, you know, I think the practical answer of that is when you discover it. Now, I can share with you, when I spoke to some countries, the short answer to this is, well, if we don't have good cybersecurity, we'll never find the breach. And if we never find the breach, we never have to notify. And that's why you'll see there are some penalties that sit behind these requirements. But, you know, again, get your own legal guidance on this, but it really is from when you start. But that 72 hours isn't an expectation to have solved the problem. It is that first bit of going, we're doing the analysis, this is what we think is going on. This is what I'm planning to do in the next few days to verify that, and here is my response strategy that I'm working to. So my guidance in this is kind of twofold. Is one, you know, have a documented strategy, test it before you ever get there to needing it, and then I actually think almost the earlier you engage with the relevant national authority, the better. I think if you go to them almost over-prepared and go, hey, we're ahead of this is what we're doing, this is what we're working out, then they're going to be like, fine, you get on with it. If somebody else goes to them and says, hey, this company's had a breach, they don't know about it, and they come to you and you go, I don't know what I'm going to do about it, then I think they're going to be sat on your shoulders the whole way through that journey. Now, I purposely leave this to the end, and it's kind of the good and the bad. Again, we're back to the glass half empty and half full. And again, depending on where you were in Europe, the fines historically have varied. In some countries, there have never been any fines. In other countries, there have been. But what they've now done is to add new penalties. And really, there's two things here. One is in many organizations, you'll now be required to have a data privacy officer who is an executive level that is accountable. So they've raised up the responsibility. And the second bit was, you know, to kind of almost at the behest of the, if I do nothing, I'll never find the problem, I don't have to report it, they wanted to put a backstop in. And so these are some of the different penalties. And I'm sure you've seen these in the news. I think of a couple of the breaches recently where they've kind of extrapolated some huge mathematical numbers. But I'd simplify it down for you into a couple of things. There are two kinds of penalties. Some that are around data processing. So, for example, you need now proper, clear consent to gather data, information from minors, underage children. There is the right to be forgotten that says you no longer have a need to hold my information, you must delete it. All of those kind of things sit in this bottom category that is up to either a maximum of 20 million euros or 4% of your global gross revenue, and it's potentially whichever is the greater. Now, two things here. These are the worst or maximum fines. And so if I kind of come up to the ones that are relevant to us, it's kind of the lighter category. So you can see data protection by design and by default, and that's referencing back to this idea of state-of-the-art cybersecurity. You could be fined up to 10 million euros or 2% of your global gross revenue. Now, kind of let me give you the real example of this. You may have a breach And that's a very sophisticated breach, and you can show you had the relative regard and state-of-the-art cybersecurity, there's not going to be any fine. You were doing the right best endeavors to stop it. If you had a simple breach, and they look at your cybersecurity strategy and go, well, it was well defined but poorly executed, then you might just get a rap on the knuckles, or you might get a small fine. So, I think these are good in terms of it raises awareness and executive level how important this is, but at the same point, I've seen a lot of media coverage that kind of overinflates what these really are. The one thing that I will say, and one question I asked was, could I be fined multiple times? And the answer is yes. So if you fail to notify, you might be fined. And if they then assess you and find you had inappropriate cybersecurity, you might be fined again. So actually, you could end up with larger than some of these look on face value. Now, what I will say, it was interesting, I don't know if it was in the Spanish news this morning, but certainly in the UK news, the CEO of TalkTalk has just stepped down. And again, when I looked at the sub-news behind that, what did they highlight? It was the commercial impact from the breach they had last year. And what I want to highlight in this is, if you look at the US, which is far more litigious historically, what you can see is legal compliance only makes about 4% of the real cost of a cyber incident. The biggest cost is brand damage. If we look in Europe, we're not that far different, but to date, our legal penalties are smaller. So I think it's good to raise awareness, but it's still not actually what has most impact on your organizations. So any questions on GDPR? I've tried to kind of keep it to the things that I think are most pertinent, which is extraterritoriality, the fact it applies to data controllers and data processors, the need for relevant regard for state-of-the-art, and breach notification. Those are probably the most fundamental principles for somebody running cybersecurity from my perspective. So let me then touch on NIS. NIS is a directive. So this is not a regulation, but the Network Information Security Directive is aligned to protecting critical national infrastructure that has digital dependencies. And this was a directive because the difference here is each nation might have different areas they perceive to be core to their critical national infrastructure. So you needed to give each country more control to define it. It fell in, and you'll see there's a whole bunch of broader requirements under the directive around information sharing, having a national cyber strategy. But for most of us here that are involved either in public or private sector organizations, the bit that applies to us is, again, they use this term of saying, you must have state-of-the-art cybersecurity. And actually, they virtually take out the relevant regard for risk, because if you're a part of critical national infrastructure, inherently the risk to the nation is high. So here you can see the kind of traditional sectors that they include: energy, transport, healthcare, finance, digital infrastructure, suppliers of utilities like water and drinking. But there's also a new category. And the requirements are a little softer, and these are still being defined. But it's kind of recognition of the world we live in. They've added in this digital service providers. So, a telco sits in that first group. This is a kind of a subgroup that says online marketplaces. So an Amazon, an eBay, those big digital online marketplaces, if I took those away tomorrow, how much would that hurt people, especially in things like rural areas that do a lot of online shopping? The same for online search engines. If I literally couldn't search anymore tomorrow, I'd kind of look for me. I'd go, well, the way I find my way around Madrid is I go Google and I, Uber, and I do all these things. And then I go online to see which is the best flight. If you took that away from me, I'd be like, I don't even have a number for a tour operator to go figure how I would get around. So there's a recognition on these. And then the third is cloud computing services. And as a security vendor, we sit in this. So we provide security updates through cloud capability. If you couldn't get those security updates, now that potentially leaves everybody exposed. So they have slightly softer requirements, but again, there are requirements on all of these. Say you must have state-of-the-art. They implicitly call out the need for proactive and preventative measures. And again, when you have an incident, you need to now notify without undue delay, straight away, work with your relevant national authority. Now, what isn't clear yet, but I've put in here, is how do they enforce this? And you'll see really basically it says each member state must have a competent authority to be monitoring and enforcing, and each member state should be applying penalties proportional to the risk and the problem that was generated. And again, this is not to say when you have an incident you're going to be fined. This is about ensuring that each of those companies takes this seriously and is applying the relevant controls, and you'd only be fined if you weren't meeting those requirements. So, summary of this, 2 different bits of legislation. One is about critical national infrastructure and its digital dependencies. The other is about protecting EU citizens' personal data. Both use exactly the same language, state-of-the-art, security by design and by default, and both add in the requirements for breach notification. Now, the most important bit is, so when have we got to be ready? And they go on different paths because these are different bits of legislation, but effectively they both end up and conclude in the same month. Both go live in May 2018. And so my challenge is, if you haven't started on this now, you need to get working pretty quickly on this. So, I've kind of gone through what is it. What I want to do now is talk a bit about how do I get there and just some of the things we've kind of gone through. The first thing is, when I started to look at this, I started having some discussions with different lawyers in the security industry, our own general counsel and others, and my question was, so how do I make state-of-the-art that's something that's defensible? Because if I go to the worst case scenario, I have a breach, I notify my national authority, our data protection authority, which is the ICO in the UK, and they come and audit me. Now, it's kind of almost in their interest to try and find a fault. And I want to prove to them that I'm in the right place and I don't have a fault. And you kind of boil it down, you get to the point where you go, so who's got the better skills and expertise? Because it's kind of like an argument with a friend. You both have an opinion. How do I kind of make that more fact-based? So I started hunting around the EU's website, trying to see if they define state-of-the-art anywhere. And what I found is they use the term in a lot of different ways. So in 2007, there was a requirement for state-of-the-art broadband to be deployed by national providers. And my favorite one here was in 2014, grants given out for state-of-the-art computer-based analysis to better diagnose memory disorders. So this kind of words seem to be everywhere, and it kind of led us to kind of challenge a bit. So how do I interpret this? So we did some research, and we engaged with IDC, and we went out and we surveyed CISOs, CIOs, business leaders around Europe to say, what do you think state-of-the-art is? And I've got the answers here. So kind of some of the kind of key words here, by far the most common is it's advanced, it's current, it's modern, it's data protection, obviously very much tied to GDPR, and encryption. It kind of worried me that, well, I just encrypt everything, that'll fix the problem, and the answer, of course, is no, because there's humans involved and we make mistakes. But then actually, even if I look at the broader level, at the word cloud it created, you'd probably think this is a good thing for a security vendor because the biggest thing by there is technology. Brilliant, everyone's going to spend more money, but we all know it's not just technology, it's people, process, and technology. And so we started trying to delve a little bit deeper, I've already covered that, and kind of go, okay, still haven't answered the question, what is state-of-the-art? And so it made me kind of think of the next question, which is, so how would I prove that to my CEO, to my board, and how would I prove that to an auditor? What are the metrics I'm going to share with them? And you can see the word cloud is even more kind of distributed. Audits, external experts, analysis, audit data, regular. There was no kind of clear, easy answer to this. And so we asked kind of, I think, probably one of the simplest questions. State of the art is an ongoing journey. It's not a one-time thing. So how frequently should I be assessing whether I am state of the art? Now again, there's some tie-in to risk here. If you said maybe as a small business with low risk, maybe you get away with doing it once a year. I think for most of us, we need to be reassessing, I would say, with the speed of change, every 6 months or even every 3 months. And if you sit in that NIS category, realistically, it's pretty well continuously. But what was really interesting was you can see today, most of us are behind that curve. We're doing it annually. So the kind of first thing is, what is it that actually state-of-the-art is? And for me, I'll kind of give you my view of this. You know, state-of-the-art is, number one, is understanding and be able to qualify and quantify my risk and show that to the business, both technically and commercially. Then it's kind of understanding the capabilities out there, and then having documented how I went through that decision of why I picked the different partners, the different technologies and processes that I did, how I apply and measure those. And I should have both lagging indicators and also leading indicators where I'm proactively probing and testing those. And I think the best guidance that I've kind of got that have gone around this journey is documentation, documentation, documentation. If you've got something that is clearly, documented of what you did, how, and why, then, you've got a good audit trail of your journey. If you get assessed and you turn up, tell me about your cybersecurity, and you get the cigarette packet out and go, on the back here was the notes I did last week, then I think you can expect a painful journey. Now, kind of share with you, and I'm going to share with you good news and bad news. So the final thing we asked people was, how are you doing? Are you ready? And you can see 58% said they're already ready. Now, we did this survey back in August in 2016, which was a couple of months before the EU actually released the final version of what GDPR was. So I challenge anybody at that point that says they're already ready, probably is kidding themselves, because how can you be ready against something you didn't actually know what the final version was going to be? It's great to see 34% expected to be ready, but what I will share with you was nearly 70% of the people when we surveyed them actually didn't know the right year the legislation came into enforcement. Number one, if you're going to be ready, make sure you're ready on the time expected, not what you think. So, I'm almost, the message I want to give here is, I think there's some complacency that it's kind of, it's easy and it's all good. And actually, depends on where you are. It might be a fairly easy transition, might be no work at all, but make sure you understand really what it is you're trying to achieve. So how do we get there? Well, I mean, the first thing for me is, as I looked at this, was to build the right team. This wasn't just my responsibility as the CISO. And interestingly, one of the first questions that I had to try and figure out is, do we need a DPO? Now, we'd already hired one. So kind of for me, that was less of a challenge, but this is really important, I think, for you to kind of get your head around. If you sit in the public sector, then it's mandatory. You have to have a data privacy officer. So if you're a government-owned entity, but because a lot of them are quite small, they may share one data privacy officer across multiple different divisions. If you're a privately owned organization, then you can see kind of here's the highlights of some of the requirements. So when your core activities consist of processing operations that require regular and systematic monitoring of data subjects on a large scale, i.e. you process a lot of information, then you should have a DPO. And again, you're probably going to, what is a large scale? Is that 1,000? Is that 100,000? Is that 1 million? I don't have a clear answer for that one. I would say err on the side of caution. I think probably what's more relevant, because for me, I kind of think all of us nearly fit in this category, is there are some other requirements. So if you are processing special kinds of data that are considered to be very personal, whether that is racial or ethnic origins, political opinions, religious, philosophical beliefs, trade union memberships, medical data such as genetic data, biometric data that could identify an individual, data concerning health, data concerning sexual orientations. Now, I would challenge you, how many of you probably hold some of that in your HR systems on your own employees? And so there's two routes. You might kind of go back and go, we don't need some of that, so let's make sure we don't have it. I think for many of us, it will inherently put the requirement for us to have a DPO. So I kind of look in GDPR, there's two halves. Data processing that sits with the DPO, and then there's cybersecurity that sits, for me, on my shoulders. But as I said, you need to have executive accountability and ownership. And so the next challenge for me was to go, who else should be involved? And I want to just share with you, this is kind of my heat map of who's involved. And what I did actually was to then go through each of those different kind of core requirements. For example, security by design and default, I looked at and went, well, I need to be working very closely with the CIO, need to understand what technology we've got, what clouds, everything we're using, to figure out where I need to put security. Because we actually provide services to customers through our products, I needed to include our product management team, understand how they're using information, what kind of capabilities they've built. We also kind of work with external partners, so I needed to understand their requirements and capabilities. Obviously myself, the DPO, our general counsel, our CEO, HR for our employees' data. We've reached out, I think like many, to external advisors and of course the incident response team. So in that, it was kind of a very broad team. Then I look at cooperating with the supervisory authority, when there is an incident. Well, actually, that's a much smaller team. At that point, it's going to be really kind of our legal team, our DPO. It's going to be our engineering team and our partners if they're involved in that, but it's not everybody. And so I would challenge you, it's a really good exercise, kind of go through each of the different articles and just go, which people should I have involved? What is their responsibility? Is it just to be notified? Is there actually information I'd need from them? Would they be the spokesperson? And this almost then starts to help you build out your fire drill process. Work through each of those different ones and go, who's involved? And, I have to be quite, some of these, as a CISO, I have some visibility to, but it's nice that they aren't part of my responsibility, and that's just as important up front to kind of define where those boundaries do belong. Now, one thing that we kind of found from this was you can get into some challenging conversations. And I think the most obvious one of this is, so why are we having this conversation? You've owned cybersecurity for the business for a number of years. Surely we're already compliant. Are you telling me we're under-secured? So I wanted to share, we actually did some more research specifically around kind of perceptions on this. And, the good thing is most of us see the new legislation as positive, a chance to raise the bar, a chance to learn from each other, and a chance to improve our cybersecurity. However, at least half of us expected to have some awkward conversations with our leadership teams around that. And I just kind of pulled out a few bits of this that I think are pertinent. Probably the most common awkward question is when a breach occurs that was driven by a human. Because there's the expectation, I think, in many ways, that cybersecurity fixes both the technical problem and the people problem. So, that's one area, and I think, again, early engagement in that. Half of us have previously reported cyber incidents to our businesses, but what I found very interesting was only 40% of us actually believed we'd done everything we could to prevent that incident. And I think that's always been the juggle of budgets and resources and everything else in many ways. But if we're now making this a shared responsibility, I think that can make that a more confident and easy conversation to have. But then I come back to this bottom statistic, which is only a third of us believe our senior management are really open to new thoughts and ideas. And if there were ever a catalyst to challenge their thoughts and ideas and make them go back and think, then this is it. And I kind of come back to this one just above, which is actually 2/3 of our senior management think we should be able to stop all of these incidents today. So there is some really rudimentary education. It's why we did the Navigating the Digital Age books, to help them understand the reality. But again, I come back to getting them involved in fire drills. There's nothing like being in the moment and being involved in it to understand some of the complexities. So there's just a few top tips here around education. We're going to share these slides with you so you can kind of read those at your leisure. I've covered a lot of these as I've gone through. So let me come into the last area. So how do I actually go through the physical process? And just a few tips that I can share with you on this. I mean, how do I figure out relative regard? To me, it's the typical Venn diagram here, which is, number one, comes back to understanding my business. Being able to go out there and say, you know, what is important to make my business function? How am I using EU systems data? What are the applications and the different users behind it? And then what I'd challenge you to do is to go test that. So for any of you that are Telefonica customers, Palo Alto customers, I'm hoping all of you one or the other, we can use our firewall just on a report and go, what traffic's really going around your network? And in every instance, I'll give you a good example, things like SFTC. You'll go, all of my customer data is in SFTC. Then suddenly you go, hold on, what are these other 4 applications that are talking to SFTC? And there are different plugins and different sub-things, maybe SAP, maybe something else, that's pulling data out from there. So make sure you kind of really understand your real information flows and what's going on in your network rather than just what you think. The next bit is to understand what is the likely threats. And again, we can help you with this because I think, you know, I'll give you the really simple example where we've talked about. So if you're in the medical industry, it's hugely pertinent at the minute. We've seen examples where medical records have been encrypted and held to ransom, and that stops literally surgery from happening. I mean, that's impacting human life. If you're a water utility company, what have you really got? The biggest part of your business is filtering and pumping water around that probably has some operational technology, machine to machine. There's no data there to encrypt. So if I look at what would be the kind of high risks, it's hugely different depending on what kind of industry you're in. So you need to look at, you know, what's relevant to your industry, what's relevant to your countries, and this should be part of your weekly ongoing assessment to go, what's likely, and then how would that impact my organization? And then the third part of that is you can now start to map that back to your technology. And again, something that we can do to help you in this is a security lifecycle review. We can actually put a box in your network and go, let's help map what's going on in your world, but let's also see what's getting through today. See if there's some obvious gaps that need plugging. So that's kind of through the first part of the discovery. Then I come back to, okay, so what is state-of-the-art cybersecurity? And we get to, I think, what is the most fundamental decision that we have to make in our security careers. It's kind of the chicken and egg problem. Do I focus on, you know, the detection and potentially prevention, or do I focus on detection and response? And actually, for me, I personally it's a seesaw. It's not one or the other, but what I think we have to do is to make a conscious decision of how we invest our money. And what I've seen is a lot of organizations focusing on response, because again, that's new, I've not needed for, so now let me focus on that, especially where what we've seen, more and more organizations being breached. And actually, what it makes me step back is to step back and look at kind of the fundamental principles and go, why are we being breached? And for me, the answer is very simple. I look at it and I go, the volume of threats we deal with is growing. The complexity of the threats are growing. The volume of different technologies that we use is growing. So what does all of that mean? It means we're generating more cybersecurity data every single day of things we discover. And the problem is the more we generate, it's not a linear growth, it's exponential. Because when I see any alert today, my IPS goes off, my AV goes off, my URL filtering goes off, my CNC, I get like 10 events, sometimes 100 events for one problem. So we're generating more and more data, but we don't have the staff to process it. So actually what's happening is we're getting slower at being able to process that volume of data. So it makes me kind of start to think back and go, I can't have more people doing manual process, so can I have more automation and machine learning, artificial intelligence, these great new techniques, actually take some humans out of the equation. So I'll come back to that for a sec. It kind of brings me to kind of the decision process that I went through. And we are in the process, I'll be very transparent, we're rebuilding our SOC, and we're rebuilding it with a prevention focus. You know, we went down the decision of going, we'll never stop 100%. It's a bit like, you know, I can teach you everything about crossing the road. You cross at a zebra crossing, you take life insurance, all these things to reduce the risk, but there's no guarantees. But at the same time, our view is that doesn't just mean we should give up, kind of close our eyes and walk blindly into the road and hope for the best. Now, I'm giving you kind of the extremes, but our view is we think we can do a lot more to prevent. So we then kind of went back and said, well, why can't we do this today? What's inhibited us? And I kind of got these two pictures of cars. I like my cars. And this is kind of the first principles analogy. So, you know, I looked at the news this morning. London's had its first black smog warning for years. So many diesel cars polluting London. They're literally advising don't run because you'll effectively choke from the pollution. So what do? We're trying to move to environmentally friendly cars. So very embarrassingly, the one at the top is the city car. And you see some of these in London, designed in London. And what they took was traditional car principles. So how does the car work? Engine at the front, you know, front-wheel drive. And then they're going, but it's a battery car. So what am I going to do? I'm going to make it as light and as small as possible to make the battery last as long as possible. And then you've got Elon Musk. And Elon Musk is a big advocate of first principles. And he says, actually what we need to do is to strip the problem back to its most bare basics and think about what is the true problem we're trying to solve. For us in cyber, it's how do we prevent attacks? And so he developed the Tesla. And the Tesla, he said, why have we got one engine? That's not efficient. Why do we not have a small engine in each wheel? It's far more efficient. Why do we have a big lead-acid battery that's filling the bonnet? Why don't I make the entire floor pan the whole battery? And lead-acid doesn't work. I'm going to develop an entire new battery capability that gives me better range, better efficiency. And so kind of my challenge to you is, when I look at cybersecurity, I see we are based on a lot of principles that have been around for a long time. Some of them still very valid, and others I look back and go, really, do they still fit for purpose? And so these were kind of my 5 kind of principles, which was, you know, think about your own balance of prevention versus response. Where do you see that balance point? And for us, I mean, literally in our SOC, the first thing now we're looking at is going, every tool, we're going, will it help us prevent, or is it just going to give me information after the fact? If it's giving us information after the fact, we're pretty well getting rid of all of them, bar a few that we go, actually, for that small percentage, we want the valuable forensics it gives, but that's kind of the minority. Then we kind of look and go, how do we become more efficient? And one of the things we looked at was there's a lot of duplication and overlap. So you think in just network analysis, how many different times do I decode SSL traffic in different places that is CPU and time intensive and is costing money and slowing the business down? Then I kind of got to probably the most important bit, which is we create this huge big data of what's going on in our world, but it's not correlated. So the most important bit for us was, how do I actually make it that as much of the different incidents that I get are in the same language, that now means they can natively be correlated together. And the analogy I always use, I think of like how the police find a criminal. You know, they build a photo fit. And it's like, blue eyes, brown hair, beard, earring, whatever. We kind of do the same, but we do so much of our prevention based on one article. This said it was bad. The more we can join those articles together, the more confidence we get. The more confidence we get, the more belief we have to do that blocking without human intervention. We're never going to get all of it, but if I can take 60, 70% of that away, what it does is it frees up the people I've got to focus on the complicated things and respond to those more quickly. To do that, I need the right intelligence. Don't drown me with just masses of everything. Tell me about the things that are pertinent to me, and when I can't figure it out, help me work through that. I need the right methods of gathering intelligence. And then the final thing for me was, if we're going through this, and it's a costly exercise, both time and investment, then I should plan for the future. Am I putting in capabilities that I can further leverage off as I move further to the cloud, into different endpoint devices? Can I bring all of this together so I'll have one ecosystem that lets me see this as the volume of data and the complexity gets bigger and bigger? So let me go back one. What we've also done to help you with this is we did some work with PwC around going through this process. So there's a white paper we can point you at. And, you know, this is really a mixture of ISO 27001, the NIS standard, industry best practices of going, how do I put together that ongoing assessment cycle of, you know, identifying, you know, what the risks are, going through the, you know, the discovery and analysis, putting in the right prevention and protection controls, and then having a response strategy. So there's a nice framework there you can leverage to help you. As a security vendor, you know, one of the things for us was, as we build out this kind of cyber mesh, having technologies that work together in that. And I'd kind of go, my 2-second plug for the company, the thing I think that makes us really unique is when we discover a threat, and it doesn't matter if we discover it in the cloud, on the endpoint, or the network, then that information is kind of shared back into the wildfire cloud. And that generates the defensive controls automatically at all those different layers, CNC blocks, the IPS blocks, the malware blocks, all of those come back automatically and get applied across everything that we're involved in, whether it's the endpoint device, whether it's the cloud, whether it's the network. And I think it's that ability to automate as much as you can that frees those people back up, that you've got to focus on the really sophisticated things. Now behind that, and this is something I'm really proud of, about 2 years ago, there was something set up called the Cyber Threat Alliance. And when I talk about people skills, probably one of the biggest people skill challenges is malware researchers, people that are really good at reverse engineering attacks. And my view is there's probably less than 100 of them in the world. So what historically has happened? Well, security vendors share samples with each other, and that's the right thing to do. But what it meant was all of the researchers were duplicating effort. The criminals collaborate really well, and we were duplicating effort. Now, some security vendors still see intelligence as a commercial differentiator, and we've been trying to quash that and say, actually, what we should do is we shouldn't just share samples, we should share actually usable intelligence. So all of the IOCs, you know, the reverse engineering of how it works. More importantly, all of the blocking controls. What are the things you need to do to stop it, and the context behind it. So we instigated the Cyber Threat Alliance. You see some great names there, Intel, Symantec, ourselves, Fortinet. And I'm really proud, actually, the first you know, telecommunications / security partner in there was 11 Paths Telefonica. And so, you know, the goal of this is to go, the more we work together, the quicker we can get to a prevention stance. And if you've not seen it, there's the website's at the top there, cyberthreatalliance.org. It's a non-profit organization. We actually tested the theory with one of the versions of CryptoWall, getting us all to work together. And what we're able to do is to move from going, hey, here's a new attack, block it, to actually looking at it in the broader perspective. We saw over 4,000 campaigns in a 6-month period, and we're able to map out architecturally how all of those campaigns worked. And what that meant was we didn't just block each variant or each campaign, but we looked at kind of, if you like, the underlying playbook behind that. How were they compromising public websites to then get to you? They were using Angular exploit kit, and they were focusing on WordPress. So if you start to understand the bigger picture, now we can block their architecture, not just the campaign or the new variant. That means we can have far more systemic impact on that attack. So I'm really proud of that initiative. Final thing in this, and I've talked about, you know, this is an investment in time and in money, but actually there is a business positive from this. And if I look at the Palo Alto Networks platform, the theory of having technology that natively works together as a single architecture to share intelligence makes a lot of sense to me. But I'm a technologist, and I'm a, you know, pragmatic person. So when I joined the company, one of the things I want to do is to go, theory sounds great, but do we live up to that in reality? So I actually went out and I surveyed about 4,500 of our customers, quick 10-minute survey, no money, no praise, anonymized, just to say, if you move down this, can we actually live up to reducing that operational overhead? Now you see there's some CapEx savings, that's kind of obvious, but the bit that was really important to me was we kind of have 4 principles. You know, firstly, visibility across everything you do. The second bit is to reduce your attack surface. Because if I can start to go, these are the business applications the way they're used, those are things I should be really securing and analyzing. I might still allow somebody else, I might allow my employees to use Facebook, but actually that shouldn't be my focus. I should just segregate that off. Leave that, that's a private use thing. So if I can reduce the attack service, then I reduce the volume of events I get, and actually I can reduce the amount of management that I do. But what was really important to me was these 2. Actually, by being able to correlate those events across different capabilities, on average, we were reducing by about 1/4 the number of security incidents that organizations got, and they were comfortable just to have an automated block response to. So we got better at doing prevention. And then behind that, actually, what we saw is the ones that did require human intervention, because we're giving rich and more contextual data, joining the pieces together, it was taking about 30% less time for a human to actually make that decision. So I'm kind of proud that we could live up to the promise. And the reason I kind of mention this is the positive view. It doesn't matter which vendor you go with, but if you go back and look at your cybersecurity architecture and readdress some of those fundamental principles, the long term is you can make your cybersecurity more efficient and reduce the cost of the business, or probably more likely, just allow you to respond in a more timely fashion, which means you'll be able to prevent more and be less responding, that hopefully will reduce then business impact, brand damage, potential fines, etc. So, very final thing on this, if you want some further help, absolutely, if you've got the experts here in the room, 11 Paths, we also can help with some consultancy services around, proactive prevention. And where do I go from here? So we keep putting more information on our website, and 11 Paths have more on their blog site. All of us are here to try and share the knowledge and experience with you. My kind of key takeaways, make sure you've got your executive ownership. Make sure they're bought into their responsibilities, what it means to the business, and they support you with it. If you haven't started, do the gap analysis. Where have I got to, where am I today, where have I got to get to? And make sure you have guidance around what you need to do. Have an action plan. You need to be kind of getting on that and working on it. And I think, one of the most important things for me is test it as you go along. Make sure you have an instant response strategy, and that's not just technical, it's got business engagement to it. So, the final time I'm gonna open it up. Any questions on any of those kind of points? Yep. Yes.
Now here the law says that fines that will be applied for the public sector are not applied really because they don't have the money to get to the authority. How does management know this kind of?
So that's a really good question. So how will those fines be applied? And I think some of the detail of that is still being ironed out. But the last kind of update that I was given was there's 2 things that are really important from an EU perspective. One is that organizations take these fines seriously. And so I met with some of the ministers down in Brussels recently, and their view is they're looking to make some early examples very quickly because, some people are doing the right things, other people are completely ignoring their responsibilities. The second thing was there was nervousness and concern around consistency of enforcement. So I know the other thing that the EU is working on is, whilst it will be down to each nation's national data protection authority to apply and enforce those fines, there is going to be a mechanism to monitor and make sure that is consistent, whether it's kind of comparing the UK with Spain, or whether it's a public or private organization. If you don't have that consistency, again, it starts to diminish people's awareness of the significance of their responsibilities.
Okay.
So this was kind of a really tough one, and just by the way, GDPR was the most hotly contested bit of legislation ever in the EU. It went through thousands of revisions. And at one point, they put in a number threshold to say if you're smaller than a certain size of business, then it doesn't apply. And then they kind of took that back away. And I think with good reason. So I've seen companies, I'll give you a good example, blockchain. I met the CEO the other week, and I think he said they were like 78 employees. So, in one respect, it's a really small business. In another respect, how many millions of records are they holding that are, sensitive information? I'll give you, for example, Estonia as a nation uses blockchain as a method of, national identity management. So they've purposely moved it away from being number of employees based to being information risk based. And it kind of comes back to there isn't kind of set boundaries of if you've got less than 10 or 100 or 1,000 records, but it's more kind of that kind of cross correlation of you might have a few records, but let's say, for example, you're a church, you're going to hold religious beliefs. It's actually higher risk than, you might be a local florist that holds 1,000 records, but all you've got is their email address to send them special offers. So again, I would encourage each one to kind of get their own legal guidance. There is a point when you get to being those kind of small organizations that there is more of a best endeavors expectation rather than being, relevant kind of state of the art. And I think that's where, it's trying to be balanced and say, what we need to do is to give confidence. Again, you might be a small organization with a lot of records and have a breach. It's just as important that you notify as it is a global organization that has a breach.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So the floodgates are open now. 2 questions.
Mientras anima a alguien, le pregunto yo. Hi, Greg. You have been talking about next generation capabilities. You mentioned at the beginning of your presentation endpoint. What do you think are the next generation capabilities all the organizations should keep in mind for the next years?
So I think 2 big shift areas at the minute, and they are cloud and endpoint. And cloud is kind of like the most complicated one, because for cloud it kind of breaks into a whole bunch of different areas. So, I can look and go, SaaS applications, is that user-driven? And actually, do I accept it or I not accept it? Is it business-driven, and is it acceptable or not acceptable? And then I kind of come up to the next level, and you go, am I using cloud services? So is that a private cloud, maybe through a partner? Is that a public cloud? Is that a public cloud through a Amazon, an AWS, or a myriad of others out there? And so the challenge in that, in many ways, for me, is a couple of things. When you kind of start digging deeper and deeper into something like AWS, I heard a figure, and I need to validate this, but the figure I heard last year was they had added something like 1 million new services to their capability. And this kind of drives kind of almost like a stake in your heart through kind of the visibility model. So the first thing is now I need to make sure my next generation security capability is natively integrated into their relevant services. So it doesn't matter whether it's the marketing team spooling it up, my product management team, or the business, I need to know it's being spooled up. Then I need to know actually what it is that's being spooled up, because what I want to do is to immediately have my relevant security controls embedded into it, whether it's my firewall or whatever else that I'm putting in there. Now, the next part of that is, and it's really simple, is kind of license management. I should be able to transpose my licenses maybe as my physical networks get smaller into there, but at the same point, if that's only up for a day, I don't want to be buying a year subscription. So I think just in that simplest bit, kind of visibility and correlation across all of that is a massive challenge, and for us is a real key area of focus of making sure we've got those integration points with those right organizations to pull that together. Some of the other areas that we're really focusing on, I kind of go back to some of the rudimentary challenges. Credential theft. So how do I spot when your credentials have actually been taken? And there is a number of different ways you start looking at this. One is kind of multi-methods of verification. So for example, some simple techniques are kind of big data analytics that say, if I see every day this person logs in this IP range, if I suddenly see they log in at 4 a.m. from a Chinese IP address, that's a pretty obvious spot. But a lot of us are roaming users, and that's a lot harder thing to do. So now what you need to start doing is going, actually, can I do some smarter analysis around that credential's usage, and actually even just putting in the right multi-factor only when it is in that process where it's something significant. But again, when it's going to be through maybe something like cloud, now you start to kind of go, how do I intertwine that into my CASB process and everything else? So those are probably a couple of areas that I see as kind of real focus. One is just visibility and integration, and then the other is kind of a specific problem for us to solve.
Thank you. ¿Alguno se anima? ¿Ninguna pregunta? Well, I will jump with my next question then. So all organizations need to prove by May 2018 deadline that they are compliant, and in order to avoid the penalties, what kind of documented processes and measures they need to implement in order to be compliant?
So, and I think the first step I'd give is leverage that PwC guide. I think it's a really nice way to work through it. And to me, at the end of the day, it's three things. Number one, I can prove that I have a good grasp on what personal information I've got in the business, and bear in mind that is your employees and your customers, and where that goes into your supply chain and partnership, and what the risk is to that, and that's physical risk, it's cyber attack risk, it's all the things. So I've got a grasp of it, and I am reassessing it on a regular basis. So that needs to be documented, and that needs to be signed off, not just by you as a security lead, but I would say your DPO, and probably whoever your other executive sponsor is. The next bit is to show how you are monitoring what are state-of-the-art capabilities. And that can be as broad as I attend Gartner IT Expo every year here in Barcelona. I have been audited by either my trusted security partner or my auditor, and they periodically come in and do a secondized set of inspection. And really then the third part behind that is, okay, so this is the risk, this is how I'm monitoring to see what I need to be doing. The third part is, how am I proving that I'm in the place that I think I am? And that comes back to having the right leading and lagging metrics that says, some of the lagging metrics, this is how we go do device discovery. This is how we make sure, we patch manage. This is how we deal with password management. So some of those are very traditional things, but I think also there's more the leading indicators that says, this is how we go test ourselves to see how quickly we'd discover a new incident. This is how we test ourselves that when something does happen, we've got the right group of people that we can get together in the right virtual team in the right time to pull this together. I think if you've got something that is clearly documented around those principles, and you are continuing to refresh that, then you'll be in a very strong place.
Thank you. Should we expect any kind of guidance or standards coming from NISA or national data privacy authorities?
So actually, NISA, and we responded to this last month, had been asked to do some advisory work around different parts of this. So at the minute, there's some work they're doing around the NIS requirements, and they actually put out a request for, industry feedback. So, NISA, in many ways, if you don't know, is the EU's, if you like, technical advisory authority. So quite rightly, they're being pulled in to try and give some guidance in some of those areas. I think it seems at the minute that's more focused on the NIS requirement than GDPR.
Okay. Thank you very much. ¿Nadie se anima? Venga, la última. Que os hemos traído aquí un poco más cercanos para ver si así conseguíamos que fuera bidireccional, pero no hay manera. ¿No os animáis? Venga, vamos a dar un fuerte aplauso a Greg, por favor.
So, and let me just add my thanks. We couldn't do this without our key partners here, 11 Pass. And let me add my thanks for putting up with my English. My hope is in the next year I'll probably be able to order a coffee and a newspaper, and in maybe 2-3 years then I'll be able to talk cybersecurity in Spanish.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Greg. Antes de que os marchéis, bueno, me voy a presentar, soy Pablo Alarcón, estoy en la unidad de alianzas de 11 Paths, y antes de que os marchéis os queríamos comentar un poco dónde está Telefónica. Pues os llevamos toda la mañana hablando de la implantación de la directiva NIS, de la nueva regulación europea de protección de datos. Quería comentaros qué estamos haciendo en Telefónica y un poco más concreto qué estamos haciendo en 11 Paths, ¿vale? En Telefónica, como muchos de vosotros, pues queremos explotar el mundo digital. Somos muy conscientes de que tenemos que conservar y generar la suficiente confianza para que nuestros clientes se animen a explotar. Seguro que estáis todos de acuerdo conmigo en que si no generamos entre todos esa confianza y la protegemos, los usuarios no se van a animar a usar los servicios digitales que les estamos ofreciendo, ¿vale? Ahora mismo en Telefónica, por lo menos en el área corporativa, Greg comentaba en su presentación que esto debería estar en la discusión, debería estar en el comité. Sabéis que en Telefónica el año pasado se ha nombrado Chief Privacy Officer, Chief Data Officer. Ahora mismo eso sí que está en el comité. Internamente se ha lanzado antes de final del año pasado un proyecto interno de evaluación más o menos, para revisar someramente qué cosas estábamos haciendo bien y qué nos faltaba de cara a cumplir con las fechas de mayo de 2018 y estar a punto de tener los sistemas y todo a punto, ¿vale? Lógicamente se está haciendo un análisis multidisciplinar. Apuntaba Greg en su presentación que es muy importante contar con numerosas áreas. En el caso concreto en Telefónica, la iniciativa parte de Chief Privacy Officer y del área de Compliance, pero está involucrado recursos humanos, seguridad interna corporativa, las áreas de negocio, etcétera. Lo que se está haciendo es un análisis de los impactos y a lo largo de los próximos meses se establecerá el plan final para implementarlo. Pensad que, aunque Telefónica como una telco, como una infraestructura crítica, lleva tiempo implementando muchas medidas de seguridad, para nosotros también es un reto y a la vez una oportunidad el cumplir y adecuar nuestros procedimientos para ofrecer los nuevos servicios digitales que garanticen la confianza de los usuarios. La otra semana publicaron un informe con motivo de la World Economic Forum en Davos, en el que se indicaba que en Europa la media de días que tarda una empresa europea en detectar una brecha de seguridad son 469 días. Eso hace 15 meses desde que un hacker, bueno, no voy a decir un hacker que se me echa encima Chema diciendo que los hackers son buenos, pero vamos a decir que alguien que quiera entrar en un sistema, viene a robar datos de carácter personal o comprometer un sistema, pasa 469 días de media sin que sea detectado en compañías europeas. Eso en comparación con la media mundial anda en 146 días, lo que os hace una idea cuando Greg comentaba de la seguridad adaptativa, lo importante que es tener medidas de prevención, pero también de detección y respuesta. También hablaba Greg de lo importante que es no solo prestar atención a la técnica, sino a la parte personal. Pensar que muchos de estos ataques, aunque la prensa siempre se llena con que son de origen muy sofisticado, dirigidos pues, de otros estados, muchas veces las brechas de seguridad se producen por el eslabón más débil, que puede ser pues, el ser humano, el trabajador o parte de la cadena de suministro que no tenemos controlada. Fijaros que en Europa solo el 23%, decía este mismo informe, solo el 23% de las empresas europeas auditan o monitorizan su cadena de suministro, con lo cual el fallo, el compromiso puede venir por ahí también. También decía, y esto es muy importante, por eso estamos haciendo un análisis multidisciplinar, fijaros que para mayo de 2018, a diferencia con Estados Unidos, donde están acostumbrados a que los titulares salgan grandes brechas de seguridad, en Europa no estamos acostumbrados a esto. Quizás la razón es porque en Estados Unidos hay como unos 50 estados que tienen legislaciones requiriendo a cada una de las empresas notificar las brechas de seguridad. En Europa no estamos acostumbrados. Solo el 12% de las empresas europeas comunican algún tipo de incidente de seguridad. Y pensar que nos tenemos que empezar a acostumbrar no solo a cómo miramos internamente y procedimentamos todo, sino también a cómo lo notificamos. A partir de mayo de 2018, la prensa, los accionistas, las agencias nacionales van a estar muy encima de las empresas para ver cómo cumplen con esta normativa. Y comunicarlo es tan importante como haberlo procedimentado. Si os pregunto quién en vuestras empresas está capacitada para ponerse delante de la prensa y justificar que tiene una brecha de seguridad frente a los accionistas, pues no es sencillo.
En Estados Unidos, con la experiencia que se tiene de la brecha de seguridad que sufrió Target versus la que tuvo Sony, quizás la diferencia, una de las mayores diferencias del éxito de Sony es precisamente cómo gestionó y notificó el incidente. Por eso es muy importante, no solo cuando defináis cómo cumplir con esta normativa, tener claro cómo lo vais a notificar. Es casi tan importante como lo anterior, ¿vale? Como os digo, ese procedimiento está en marcha y eso lo que nos va a llevar es a proteger y a generar más confianza. Ser compliant con esta normativa que ha contado Greg generará confianza en los usuarios, pero en Telefónica queremos ir más allá. No sé si habéis oído que estamos totalmente orientados a devolver el control de los datos a los usuarios. Llevamos ya tiempo diciendo que ha llegado el momento. Sabréis que hay una unidad creada nueva, una unidad global que se llama Big Data y tiene una compañía nueva que es Luca. Llevan ya medio año o un año trabajando en convertir a Telefónica en una empresa guiada por los datos. Y os invito a aquellos que tengáis oportunidad de participar en el Mobile World Congress a finales de febrero, de visitar el stand de Telefónica o de estar atentos a los mensajes que vamos a dar, porque os van a gustar. Ahí os vamos a mostrar la solución y hacia dónde vamos en Telefónica para no solo proteger y generar confianza, sino devolver ese control al usuario legítimo, que sois vosotros, los clientes y los propietarios. En 11path, de cara a esta normativa, lo que estamos haciendo es, como apuntaba Rames, hemos creado un grupo de alianzas, tenemos varias categorías y nos estamos apoyando en este caso en los aliados estratégicos como Palo Alto y estamos eligiendo a todos ellos un poco por lo que decía Greg. Hablaba de State of the Art, la traducción en España ha sido algo así como estado de la técnica, pero lo que necesitamos es buscar los partners más punteros, las tecnologías más punteras, que junto con la combinación que vamos a hacer internamente en nuestros procesos nos lleve a garantizar que tenemos los mejores servicios. Ahí estamos trabajando en temas de identidad, de seguridad móvil, que lo ha mencionado él, de riesgo normativo, de detección, prevención y respuesta. Todo eso estamos trabajando junto con los partners estratégicos para ofreceros esas capacidades. Y sin más, si no me entretengo, vamos a pasar al café. Espero que podáis hacer networking con tanto la gente con Palo Alto como nosotros. Dime.
Ahora os invitamos a rellenar la encuesta, que es muy importante para nosotros, conocer vuestro feedback. Y luego vais a tener disponibles unos pendrive que va implícita una licencia de MetaShield, muy importante el tema de borrado de metadatos. Y nada, daros las gracias por estar aquí, ya que Pablo ha ocupado todo el tiempo y espero contar con vosotros la próxima vez. Muchas gracias.